Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on proposed federal clean energy standards. We really appreciate your taking the time to be part of this, and I do want to point out to all of you that we do have, as part of the hour coming up, a time for questions from you all in the audience. On your dashboard on the right, you'll see a questions area where if you type your questions in, we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. I also want to thank our partners. We are very fortunate at OEP to have a broad cross-section of the energy community supporting our efforts, and we're very grateful for their support. And I particularly want to thank today our co-host, the Electric Power Supply Association, and in a minute I'm going to turn it over to the CEO of that organization, Todd Snitchler, to moderate our panel. But before we get to that, we are very honored and fortunate today to have Senator Tina Smith from Minnesota joining us to give opening remarks on a federal clean energy standard. Senator Smith, since joining the Senate in 2018, has been a leader in this area. Minnesota itself has been a leader in finding affordable ways to reduce emissions, and she has been a strong advocate for a federal clean energy standard. In fact, in 2019, she and then Representative Ben Ray Lujan, now Senator Lujan, introduced the Clean Energy Standards Act of 2019. And in this Congress, she has worked very strongly and been a leader, very involved in attempting to pass a clean electricity standard in this Congress. So we're very fortunate to have her joining us today. Senator Smith will deliver opening remarks, and then we'll get to our panel. Senator Smith.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Bill. And it is great to be with all of you here from my hideaway in the United States Capitol. Just a huge thanks to Bill and Our Energy Policy for organizing this webinar, and for the panelists that are going to be going into the details, and to all of you for joining in. I'm proud to join you as a fellow energy nerd as we think about what kind of energy policy our country needs. I'd like to just give, as Bill said, some sort of general framing comments about this as you to lead into this panel. And you know, I start from the place that we are at a crucial moment, a pivotal moment on climate action. It's clearly the fires, the floods, the droughts that we're experiencing in my own state of Minnesota demonstrate that the cost of inaction on climate is too high. It is so obvious to people in Minnesota that this is something that we need to do. The opportunity that we have in the Build Back Better legislation that we are hoping to pass this summer in Congress is huge. It is an opportunity to take progressive but also practical steps to move us towards a clean energy transition that is going to create jobs, that is going to improve our health, and is going to make a transformational commitment to reducing carbon emissions. And I see the Clean Electricity Standard as really a foundation building block for this work, working together with tax incentives, energy efficiency incentives, efforts to electrify our economy in other ways, including transportation and charging stations. And I also think that it works really well with the civilian climate corps idea that has been proposed by some of my colleagues. So as you all know, a clean electricity standard is really simple. It sets a goal for getting to net zero carbon emissions in the power sector, in the utility sector, by a date certain. Now, when Ben Ray Lujan and I introduced our legislation back in 2019, we really conceptualized this as a regulatory approach, and it was built on and based on bipartisan legislation that Democrats and Republicans, including Jeff Bingaman, then Senator from New Mexico, and Lindsey Graham had introduced. During the course of this past year, we have evolved this policy into much more of an investment-based, budget-based strategy. And I think that that evolution has strengthened it. I believe that it provides the right kinds of incentives for utilities to add clean power, And I think it also will be incredibly beneficial to our overall goal of keeping utility rates stable for ratepayers, both individuals, families, as well as big manufacturing facilities like we have in Minnesota and elsewhere in the country. Keeping rates low will be a big advantage of this. The clean electricity standard that we are working on will fit, I believe, well within the budget reconciliation process, which, as you know, is fundamentally an effort that is a budget effort. And that's what this is. It is a budget line item to provide incentives to utilities to add clean energy. We say in our proposal that anything that is clean counts. So this is this is very important to utilities and co-ops and municipal utilities, as well as the big investor-owned utilities around the country, because some of them are heavy on nuclear. Some of them have already made steps to add significant renewables. But as long as it's clean, it would count towards the incentive that we envision here. It also says to utilities that you can start from where you are. There is no penalty or advantage to being at 40% clean energy versus 10% clean energy. We want every utility to be able to see a path for adding clean energy as we move forward. Now, the reason that this is a practical approach is because we know that 30 states plus the District of Columbia have already passed some form of clean electricity standard or renewable energy standard, and this has shown that it is highly effective in reducing carbon emissions without increasing electricity costs. It is, as I said, I think it also has the strength of being originally at least a bipartisan strategy. Now, whether in this day and age and Congress will be able to attract bipartisan support remains to be seen. But I think that it is clearly bipartisan out in the big world of America, where the idea of a clean electricity standard is strongly popular amongst Democrats and independents and even Republicans, signifying that Americans see the benefit of this kind of a strategy. They want to see their power be generated by clean sources, and they appreciate that this can be good also for creating jobs in America and for making sure that we keep the energy independence that is so important to many people, including many of my colleagues. I have hinted at this a little bit, but I'll just come back to it to say that I believe that this policy clearly fits within the Senate's arcane budget reconciliation process, which is essentially another way of passing a budget. The incentives that we have included here are designed to be payment-based. They are designed to help utilities keep rates low and keep rates stable. And that is going to be, I think, another big advantage. So I want to just say, as I wrap up here, that this, I believe, is exactly the kind of policy that we need right now. It is something that is proven effective in states across the country. It is something that supports directly the needs that we have in our country to build out of what has been a terrible 18 months of living through this pandemic by getting our economy going again. And it clearly addresses the need that we have right now, an urgent need right now, to address the climate crisis that is already costing us literally billions of dollars. So I'm grateful for all of you for your interest in this subject. I wish I could hang around and listen to the panel, but unfortunately I've got to move on to some other Senate business. And just thank you so much, Bill, for your interest and for organizing this panel.
Well, thank you, Senator Smith, for sharing those thoughts with us, for your leadership on this issue, and in particular for seeking to create a bipartisan approach that can bring everybody together around this topic. So thank you again, and we look forward to following your work in the Senate as this continues to move forward. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. And we're now going to turn things over to Todd Snitchler, the President and CEO of the Electric Power Supply Association, which represents competitive power generation asset companies throughout the country. Todd is a former Vice President for Market Development at API and elected twice to the Assembly of the State of Ohio, as well as the chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Ohio. So a long and distinguished career that I could spend quite a few more minutes describing. But Todd, I think I'm just going to say we're delighted to turn it over to you and to introduce our panel to discuss this important topic.
Thanks, Bill. Really appreciate the opportunity to moderate this discussion with three really qualified folks who I think are going to have an interesting discussion and hopefully leave folks with a better understanding of where we are. So I think all of you can turn on your cameras and we'll try to get started. First and foremost, I just want to make sure that I introduce the Electric Power Supply Association. As Bill notes, we're a national trade association that represents competitive power suppliers or independent power producers. And our members own and operate approximately 150,000 megawatts of all types of resources across the country. They're leading in the development of new technologies and innovation because as a non-utility power provider, they have to do that in order to make sure they continue to operate. And that's why we're committed to finding policies that harness the power of markets and competition, but deliver emissions reductions as our members support reduction in carbon emissions and believe that climate change is an issue that we have a responsibility to try and address. We, like many others, believe that an economy-wide price on carbon would be the most efficient approach. I don't think everyone agrees with that. We may hear a little about that in our panel today, but recent analysis has shown that a well-designed clean energy standard could also approach the efficiency and cost effectiveness of an economy-wide price on carbon. What's more, EPSA has developed a set of elements we think should be included in a well-designed CES, and you can find all that and more about us at our website, EPSA.org. But enough about us. Without further ado, we want to dig into the issue on the table today, what it will mean for our economy, for our energy future, and consumers. And we have three great panelists that are going to walk us through a lot of the specifics and hopefully answer some questions you may have. So I'll do brief introductions. If you want to learn more about them, you can find more information on the Our Energy Policy webpage. First is Lindsay Walter. Lindsay is the Deputy Director of Third Way's Climate and Energy Program. She manages their climate policy portfolio, developing and advocating for sector-specific standards, incentives, and investments in innovation and infrastructure to reach net zero emissions. Prior to working at Third Way, Lindsay worked at the Center on Global Energy Policy, researching the geopolitics of clean energy. Our second panelist is Arnie Olson. Arnie is a senior partner with E3, where he leads E3's bulk energy infrastructure practice area, helping clients navigate challenges to the bulk electric system, operations, and investment needs that are brought about by increasing policy and market interest in clean and renewable energy production. He's led a number of landmark studies of the feasibility and costs of achieving deep decarbonization and high renewable penetration goals for electric utilities, including 100% study of 100% renewables in California, the Pacific Northwest, New England, and the Upper Midwest. And last but certainly not least, our third panelist is Devin Hartman. Devin is the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at the R Street Institute, where he leads a team that brings a pragmatic and analytically sound pro-market perspective to energy and environmental policy. Devin joined R Street in 2020 after serving as the president and CEO of the Electricity Consumers Resource Council, or ELCON, as you may know them, which is a national association of large industrial users of electricity. So with that, let's move on to some questions so that we can have a good dialogue about where we are and where we're headed. I think as a good first step, and Lindsay, I'll ask you to go first, and then we can kind of walk through in the order you were introduced. What is your organization's viewpoint on a federal clean energy standard, and why do you have that view?
Thanks, Todd. So Third Way is a think tank based here in Washington, D.C., and we really advocate for a technology inclusive approach to put the U.S. on the track to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And as part of that, we know the power sector is a crucial piece of getting all the way there. And we believe that a clean energy standard is the best way to ensure that we are building out clean energy at the rate we need to in order to reach our climate goals, which is twice the rate that we've ever achieved historically. And having this policy in place will guarantee that demand and drive for these clean energy technologies. So we've been supportive for a clean energy standard for over a decade now, and have been really a champion for the policy because we think it is the tool that we need to get our power sector to net zero emissions.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Arnie?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Happy to be here. I think Senator Smith stated very well the need for a step like this. I couldn't agree more with the urgency of it, the importance of it, the practical nature of a clean energy standard as a way to approach this. You know, Todd, you mentioned some of the studies that have been done recently that suggest that a well-designed clean energy standard can be very efficient in terms of achieving low-cost emission reductions, and E3 was a part of some of those studies, and so I think that lines up very well with some of the technical work. It's simple, it's scalable, and it needs to happen soon.
Great, thanks, Arnie. Devin?
Thanks, Todd, and thanks for having me, and great opening comments by the other panelists and by Senator Smith. You know, our view on a clean energy standard shares the perspective of the urgency of the clean energy transition, but as a tool, we do not support a CES. And that's fundamentally because we do not think that it addresses the true ailments of the clean energy transition. And that is, a CES, when you really dig into it, is about stimulating artificial demand for clean energy, of which the combination of state policies and organic market demand right now is already enough to drive deep decarbonization as is. The real problem is that that transition is in peril because the regulatory state simply isn't letting us deploy capital and manage it in an efficient way sufficient to meet that existing demand. So ultimately, what we really need to do if we're serious about the clean energy transition in a results-oriented way is to start talking about how to reform the regulatory apparatus, especially things tying to the planning, permitting, and siting processes, and anything that ultimately infuses competition into the generation and transmission components of electric supply. Thank you.
Thanks, Devin. I think this is a terrific example of how our energy policy tries to encourage a diversity of viewpoints and have a civil discourse around some of these issues. So I think it's nice that we kick off with that. We may hear more of that as we go on. So Devin, I won't throw my next question to you because I suspect I know what your answer might be. But so Lindsay and Arnie, can you talk a little bit about how you view an optimal CES policy at the federal level? How would it work? How would it be enforced? What are some of the mechanics of how that would go? And Devin, of course, you're welcome to chime in, even though we now have a very clear picture about where you are on the question of a CES. And Lindsay, if you want to go first, fire away.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So there are several ways that we could design a federal CES. You know, at its core, you want to require an increasing percentage of clean energy for utilities or at load serving entities. I think that's the optimal point of compliance, as one might say, for a clean energy standard at the federal level, is at the load serving entity. You know, I'm more supportive of having a requirement be on increasing shares of clean energy rather than, maybe we'll get into this later, a mass-based or emissions-based approach. I think, you know, the focus really is on building out clean energy, and with the state level policies also being on the, you know, increasing your shares of megawatt hours is more likely the better federal policy. So crucial to Senator Smith's policy, I also think it's smart to start where utilities are at, right? To expect utilities to begin where they're at and increase their share from there. I think it is more politically viable, and it also recognizes the challenges that utilities starting behind the curve will have, and encouraging them to make improvements from where they're at rather than playing a massive game of catch up, I think is an important aspect to include. I also think another crucial way to design the CES is it has to be technology inclusive. That's one of the huge benefits of the clean electricity standard in general. So making sure that all zero carbon or low carbon technologies can compete under the CES, including technologies like nuclear and carbon capture, are going to be fundamental towards ensuring we're not only decarbonizing our grid, but we also still have those firm dispatchable resources that we need to ensure reliability in the grid. So there's a lot of other kind of design aspects of a CES that I'm happy to get into, but I think as far as general structure goes, that's how I prefer to design it. You know, obviously it has to hit 100% clean by 2050 to be in line with our climate goals. Recent analysis shows it might need to be sooner than that, and the Biden administration is aiming for 100% by 2035. You know, I think we should have that conversation on when we get all the way to 100, but at minimum, we're looking at by 2050 at the absolute latest.
Arnie?
Yeah, well, I'm also not in the camp that this is the ideal policy, and it certainly isn't the be all and end all of climate policy. But the question is it a good step that we can take now? Is it a no regrets or a least regret step that we can take now? And I think the answer is yes. I think there's no question that we need to scale up clean energy in a very dramatic way and very, very quickly, and this will set us on the path to do that. In terms of the specific design elements, I think it'll be important for it to have a couple of principles. One, as I said earlier, it needs to be simple. I think a clean energy standard can be. It's megawatt hours of clean energy generated divided by megawatt hours of retail sales. That's very simple. You can generate a REC or a certificate by generating a megawatt hour of clean energy anywhere, and those can be traded in the secondary market very efficiently. I think it also needs to be universal in scale. So it needs to be national, and it needs to be inclusive in terms of all the different technologies that can create clean energy. So with those characteristics, I think there's lots of details that would need to get sorted out about the compliance, but those are the principles that I think are important.
Devin, anything you want to add to that?
Sure, and I'd say, our overarching, view of a CES notwithstanding, we're always happy to engage in the conversation of if it's a foregone, decision that we're going to go down this path, how do we do it to the best of our ability? And I really agree actually with Lindsay and Arnie on almost all those design components, especially being more technology inclusive. The one thing that I would really stress is if we want to talk about how clean energy production displaces emissions in the most optimal manner, we really need to talk about a more surgical instrument that can start to marry up actual emissions displacement with the actual production of energy and tying compensation to that. That does require things like a more complex information infrastructure overall, but especially where I think a CES could ever potentially induce additional clean energy demand, it's actually going to be in that more 50 to 100% range of clean energy deployment, and that's where you start seeing a lot of areas where the marginal emissions displacement of new energy sources is very sensitive to real-time grid conditions and regionality.
Can I make a comment based
Sure.
on what Devin said? So I actually agree that with the state level policies and with the way that the capital markets are going right now, that there's an incredible demand for clean energy. I think Americans recognize that not only the climate benefits, but quite frankly, the job and economic benefits at the local level of clean energy. And so I do think that we're moving in that direction. Where I view the CES as necessary is it's a question of scale and of timing, and that I don't think the research supports that we're headed that path in the timeline needed to address our climate goals. Are we headed that direction? Absolutely. Is it fast enough to appropriately respond to the climate crisis? Absolutely not. So that's where I think the CES, yes, it does kind of create that additional demand. And I do agree with you, it's headed that way, but it's really about, accelerating our pathway to get to 100% clean electricity.
And
Well, the jurisdictions that are early adopters, just quickly, Todd, the jurisdictions that are early adopters are going to help us get down the road, but I don't think it's also equitable to ask them to bear the entire burden of solving the climate problem on behalf of everybody else. So ultimately, we need to get to a much larger scale. We need to get to a national scale, and we need to get to a global scale, and this is a step in that direction.
So Arnie, I was going to come to you next because some of the discussion already has kind of led into the concept that you guys have studied with how we might address this, looking at the state level and kind of having the bottom-up approach. So how do you view the interaction of a clean energy standard at the federal level and how it might work with existing state policies? Or is there a way for there to be state policies that could very easily be encompassed by a federal clean energy standard when it passes at some point in the future?
Yeah, so we've been pretty strong in saying that we need something on a national scale to help us again address the climate challenge. That doesn't necessarily mean that individual states couldn't go farther, go faster, have their own definitions as part of that. So the efficiency benefit is if we can do this on a 50-state basis, if we can trade off emission reductions and clean energy implementation in one region versus another to achieve the lowest cost clean energy pathway over the next 10 years. But certainly early adopters are going to be early adopters, and I don't think we want to do anything to hinder that.
Any response to Arnie's comment?
I mean, I agree. I think a federal CES can complement the state level existing standards very well. I think you have to be intentional about how they're going to interact and be smart about how you do it, but it can be done. And I do think, if states have more ambitious policies, they should be able to keep that requirement, but ultimately all states should have to fall under any federal requirement that's passed. So I think it would be very complementary. Of course, there's a huge benefit to having a national unified standard instead of a patchwork of state level CESs. Of course, I'm very supportive of states passing CESs, have to do the heavy lifting in the absence of federal action, but getting that kind of unified standard at the federal level is essential.
Yeah, there's various design components that would affect whether a federal CES would be complementary or actually just supplant some state policies that are already on the books. And then the natural cost implications could go in different directions, not to mention the politics. So I think that that's important to always think about harmonizing these things, because there is, to Lindsay's point, an enormous patchwork right now. And a lot of what the states have done is add certain stipulations to a lot of components. Whereas I do think if you have a more homogeneous base product, which is something Arnie has done research on, especially in a more voluntary construct approach, you could actually have lower incremental costs of the clean energy transition by having a lower cost product that is more fungible across multiple states, if not the entire country.
Thanks for that, Devin. Lindsay touched on a point a moment ago I'd like to come back to and get each of your thoughts on. Some have suggested that instead of setting a federal standard in terms of a percentage of electricity generated by clean energy, we should focus on some emissions reduction requirement or some other alternative approach. I'm interested in your views on how you view that first approach, and if you agree or disagree, and if you have an alternative approach that you think is better, what is it and why would you support that? So Devin, I guess I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think with the tie to emissions reductions is huge. Of course, a lot of the clean energy policy agenda is driven by more than just air emissions displacement. A lot of times it's very focused just on carbon. I think that it's important to be more inclusive of a broader suite of air pollutants in this conversation, just because a lot of those do have social costs that actually exceed even carbon on a per unit basis right now. So it's really important to think about the broader set of environmental implications of these types of policies. But I think that overall, if we start focusing more on the true problem, which is emissions and emissions reductions, the more we can tie our policies to that and lowering the costs, the per unit costs of reducing emissions, the more that we can drive a clean energy transition that is consistent with the self-interest of our economic future. And that is what sets a model that the rest of the world is more likely to learn from. And that's ultimately what matters for the future of climate.
I guess I can go next. I don't disagree with that. I think we do need to get to a system in which we're pricing emissions and regulating emissions rather than pushing forward resources that rather than regulating emissions indirectly by subsidizing or investing in clean resources. I just think it's a lot more complicated to regulate emissions, and it's a lot more politically difficult to make that deal now. There are a lot of equity implications, transfers, distributional impacts from pricing carbon that are really complicated to work out. So I think we do need to get there eventually, but I don't think we're there now as a nation to be able to pass that type of a policy. So can we focus on something in the near term that moves us in the right direction immediately? It gets early action, gets lots of clean energy in the ground. I don't think we're going to regret that decision, even if it's not the perfect policy with respect to carbon emission reductions.
Yeah, I agree. Without turning this into a carbon pricing debate, there are obvious benefits to doing a carbon price. I wish we'd done one 15 years ago. It would have made our lives a lot easier. Now, the level at which you would need to implement a carbon price is a high level, very politically difficult to achieve. As far as within a CES goes, I think the focus is really on building out clean energy. And that's why I support, a CES that's focused on building out in percentages of clean energy. And that's really the driving motivation. Now, if we decide to do a mass-based CES, fine. I'm ultimately supportive of the CES that will pass because that's the most important design feature that you can have. But I think it makes more sense given the state level policies where they're at and the goals that we're ultimately trying to achieve with the CES for it to be focused on building out clean energy, because that's really what we're trying to achieve here.
And I think that kind of leads in some of your comments, all of your comments actually lead into kind of one of the next questions that I think is kind of, it's a practical starting point, which is some people are concerned that the administration's goal of 100% reduction by 2035, or even the 80% by 2030 is too aggressive and not technically achievable or feasible. What's the right way to balance the necessary approach that needs to be taken to reduce emissions, has the best chance of passing, and frankly can maintain the affordability that Senator Smith mentioned and that markets are so good at providing, because the potential for this to get expensive is very omnipresent. So how do you address some of those issues? And is that really achievable or feasible? There's a lot there, so unpack it as you'd like.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I hate to keep talking, but so right now, the policy conversation is really focused around 100% by 2030. That is the, the reconcilable or investment-based clean energy standard that Senator Smith was discussing in her opening remarks, and is where Congress is at this exact moment. So I want to start by talking about 80 by 30 first, because that is technically achievable and it is affordable. In fact, there's a lot of estimates that show that 80 by 30 could actually reduce energy prices by up to 2%. So, if we're talking about baby steps, here's where we're focusing right now in the policy conversation. 80 by 30, we know we can do, we have the technologies, we have the ability to make sure that it's a reliable, affordable grid on the way there. And the design that Senator Smith is talking about, because it's federal investments for utilities to build out clean energy, it's actually shifting costs compared to like a regular order CES from the ratepayer to the more progressive tax base. So huge benefits in that approach, at least to get us to 80 by 30. The question of 100%, I think it's a lot more difficult. You see utilities coming out and saying, hey, look, we're okay with this, but we need some help on the innovation front to make sure that we have firm dispatchable, affordable technologies to get all the way to 100. Whether or not we can do that by 2035, or we're going to need a little bit more runway to ensure the affordability of that, is still a question and a definite challenge, I think, to meeting a 100% CES. And there's been some really clever designs that are being discussed on how to deal with that. I think, the Schrader-McKinley bill has some approach to help bring down the cost of those technologies. The DeGette team is thinking through a way to incorporate, okay, if it's affordable, let's make a more ambitious goal. If it's less affordable, then let's, have a longer runway. So there are ways to build into the CES flexibility to ensure that it remains affordable.
Yeah, I just want to echo the importance of that. I think it's imperative that when we think about things like a CES, that we recognize that those are partial early steps. What we ultimately need is an economy-wide, nationwide carbon policy that addresses all of the different sectors, all the places that carbon and other greenhouse gases are emitted, and within the context of a comprehensive policy. Whenever we're taking a partial step, we want to make sure that what we're doing is in line with what that ultimate comprehensive policy would do, so it truly is a no regrets early step. One of the ways that a thing like this could become a step with regrets is if we sacrifice reliability or affordability. And one of the ways that we're going to decarbonize the transportation sector is we're seeing the really exciting uptake in electric vehicles and all the different models that are out there. If we make electricity unaffordable, that's really going to hinder our transition to electric vehicles. It's going to hinder our transition to electrified heating technologies in buildings. So we really need to make sure that we maintain affordability in our electricity sector. And we've seen recently how important reliability is and how we really can't take that for granted. And so that's going to be really important as well. So we need to have those sort of guardrails on the CES as we roll it out. That said, I think the mechanism itself lends itself very well to something like, an alternative compliance payment that says, if the cost of a certificate gets above a certain amount, the government will release more. And so we won't force people to do the things that are really, really expensive now. At the same time, I think we need to move aggressively to invest in some of the clean, firm technologies that will allow us to get all to 100%. And whether that's clean nuclear or carbon capture or hydrogen or long duration storage, there's a variety of candidates, but they're all early days in terms of their maturation, and they need help and investment from the federal government as well.
Yeah, I would definitely echo those points, and I do think that there's a couple specific CES design components that we can learn from existing or previous federal and state environmental policies. So one is a lot of RPS policies will have sort of like a cost safety valve, if you will, in there. That there's ways to monitor that and trigger that to adjust the stringency of the policy automatically based on sort of an independent review of the cost impact. And then also very similar to what we saw with the mercury air toxic standard, as we might recall under the Obama administration, there was a reliability safety valve that was built into that form of a policy. We can do something similar to that. That's a great way to Arnie's point of making sure that a very aggressive CES doesn't become a regretful policy because you know, I think there's multiple studies that I'd say the better studies right now show that the incremental costs of decarbonization, the supply curve is very flat for a great level, and then all of a sudden it skyrockets upwards. So there's a big threshold when you start getting into some of this, and a lot of those studies are really, I'd caution a lot of folks about what we take away from these 10, 15-year forward-looking studies. The very good ones are only indicative of how policy change may affect outcomes, and then frankly, and a lot of them, if not the majority of them, aren't really even that indicative of many things in the future. And a lot of times the policy conversation assumes that these policies are predictive of the future. They're really not. To flag a couple comments that we've heard out of the reliability community recently, and we've had this conversation before, Todd, right? The North American Electric Reliability Corporation head has even said that right now the pace of the energy transition is basically putting the reliability community on alert. This goes back to a lot of the other points of the regulatory apparatus. Right now, the next stage of the clean energy transition is not going to be accommodated well with the existing regulatory architecture, let alone the stage after that. So we really have to focus on getting the regulatory blueprint correct to hit that 50 to 70% of lower to mid-hanging fruit on decarbonization. And then to Arnie's point, to really have that firm clean kick in. I think that's where we talk about innovation policy to get that next level of technology development that lets us hit that last, you know, 1/3 or quarter of decarbonization as soon as possible.
Thanks for that, Devin. And Arnie and Lindsay have both mentioned in different ways points that I think Lindsay brought up, the Schrader-McKinley bill, which is, for those that aren't familiar, it's structured to include a period of aggressive energy innovation funding prior to the implementation of any CES, and it's a 10-year period that's subject to change based on technology readiness indicators, and that's innovation and how that happens. How do you view that as a potential alternative or a strategy to look at for how we would get some of the things that Devin just noted about the low-hanging fruit, or that Arnie has noted about the need for deployment of newer technologies or lower emitting technologies? Is that something that you think is feasible, and perhaps, you know, prognosticate a little about whether it's passable if you're so inclined to take a walk out that plank?
I'll start on this one. I mean, I worry a little bit about what that technology indicator path might look like. That sounds very subjective to me. I also don't think we need to wait to start down the road of getting the 50 to 70 to maybe 80% clean energy by 2030. So I would worry about waiting 10 years before doing anything. I think we need to do a lot, and we need to do it right away, and we can do it right away in a way that is a no regrets or low regrets policy. That said, I think it's really important to invest in those additional technologies that will help us get from 70, 80% all the way to 100. So definitely very supportive of a strong federal R&D law.
I agree with Arnie. Look, it's the only bipartisan proposal that we have out there, which is a huge strength, right? And I appreciate that we're trying to marry some of the different priorities on, you know, innovation on the Republican side, and Democrats are also supportive of innovation and want the CES. So, you know, I do think it's a clever way to try and marry these priorities, and do applaud that work. I think I agree with Arnie that there's no need to wait and have that CES really driving and accelerating the build out of clean energy. We have the technologies now to get the majority of the way there, and it's all about accelerating that and building out the rate. And, you know, to a point Arnie made earlier, if we're doing this correctly, if we're really on track to get to net zero emissions by 2050, because of electrification of vehicles and buildings and other parts of the economy, we're looking at a doubling of energy demand by 2050. So we're not only trying to build out enough clean energy to get to 80% of today's demand, but of that future energy demand as well. So it's really important that we get started now, and I don't see a reason to wait on a CES. We're in a time crunch here. But absolutely agree that innovation is an essential component of this, and it's really key to the work that we do here on Third Way, is making sure that we have all of the tools that we need, not just for the power sector, but for things like industry, where we don't have a lot of zero carbon substitutes. So absolutely support the innovation funding, don't need to wait for the CES.
I think it's good to the one point I'll flag that I was encouraged to hear in this piece of legislation, and I think both Arnie and Lindsay kind of were talking about different technology developments levels and some concerns with defining that and operationalizing that in a type of support package. DOE has these TDLs, right, technology development levels, that they already use in those conversations. Keep in mind that really what we're after here is not direct emissions reduction support. We're actually going after R&D spillover benefits, right? Things that the private sector isn't doing. So this way, we're not just crowding out what the private sector wants to invest in. We're actually addressing things with very responsible use of taxpayer dollars to make sure that we're channeling it towards R&D efforts, which tend to have more benefits upstream, things like ARPA-E, right, on a per dollar return basis. Those are things that we should absolutely be doing very aggressively and responsibly, and then really ratcheting down the level of public support as the commercialization of a given technology gets closer to market. And then on the future conversation that we've always had with the future of tax credits in this country, I don't really see any sound economic arguments to financially to be subsidizing commercially mature technologies. But what you can do is you can actually start defining levels up front and support in terms of pegging it to economies of scale, and then basically phasing out any types of tax credit policies, and that can both really reduce the overall burden on taxpayers and actually concentrate public assistance where it's going to get more bang for its buck.
I'd like to try and sneak in one last question, because I think it puts a nice bow on the conversation we just had before Kevin comes in and tells me that we're going to take our questions from the audience, which we definitely want to do as well. But what other tools might complement a CES that would help address the questions of climate change? For example, CES only addresses the electric sector. I think everybody has mentioned it in one way or another, that there's clearly the rest of the economy that needs some attention to be focused on it. But is there an analogous approach to other ways that we can decarbonize transportation or manufacturing or buildings or industry, what have you, more broadly? Do you see anything that's like that? And then I'll stop asking questions and we'll take questions from the floor.
I can go. There are a lot of complementary policies that you need along with the CES, right? There's no silver bullet policy to addressing climate change, but some ones that I think are especially complementary to a CES are policies to encourage the build out of transmission lines along with this build out of clean energy. That's absolutely essential. There's a huge challenge on the permitting and siting side here, both for these clean energy projects and also for the big transmission lines. So policies that directly target that are very complementary. A CES naturally encourages energy efficiency, but additional energy efficiency policies will also help us reduce that overall energy demand and make it easier to meet this goal. And we've already kind of touched on some of the innovation policies to make sure that we have all of the options on the table. But I will also say methane policies to reduce methane leakages from natural gas are essential. And that is another big priority, especially when we're talking power sector, that we need to focus on. So I could go on for like a day talking about climate policies I want to see passed, but those are ones I see as very complementary to a CES.
Yeah, I would agree with those and add expansion of competitive markets into areas that don't have them now, like the West and the Southeast, could be really beneficial to lowering and minimizing the cost of achieving a federal CES. Lots and lots of other hard issues to tackle around natural gas transition and how to decarbonize industry. Really, really important, maybe not quite orthogonal to the issue of a federal CES.
Yeah, I think I'll just put a little bit more meat on the bones for some of the regulatory overhaul that's needed. And it's great to hear Lindsay bring up transmission, because that is a regulatory nightmare right now. Speaking of the 2035 target, just to talk about the level of transmission that would be needed to even get halfway there, When I've talked to some transmission developers, they're like, projects that we have in the early planning phase right now, we won't even have steel in the ground until the 2030s. So right now, just goes back to the point that right now we have fundamental flaws in the planning process, permitting process, and siting process, not just for transmission, but you get into actual like market design components that we're fundamentally talking about having imperfect substitutes, where we have unconventional resources being the backbone of the clean energy transition, substituting for conventional resources. We have a lot of room for improvement in market design and those processes to let that transition occur in a way that's cost effective and reliable. And it also gives reliability authorities the confidence that we can manage this transition in a reliable fashion. And then, lastly, I'd also just put out there for the transportation and industrial sectors, one of the biggest pathways that we're hearing about ways to decarbonize those sectors is through electrification. So fundamentally, electricity is a substitute fuel in those other sectors. In order to pull the abatement costs down, in order to make it more economically attractive to reduce those, we need cheaper electricity, and we need to make sure that the quality of that service is there. So one of the big things that we see a lot of those industries pushing for now is to Arnie's point, the expansion of competitive markets. So I'd like to say to expand and improve competitive electricity markets, wholesale and retail, is imperative as part of this conversation.
Great, I'll jump in here. Thank you very much to Todd and to our panelists for a great panel so far. We do have a lot of questions lined up, so we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. First question here for the panel is from Carl Perez. Many of the state clean energy standards have excluded nuclear. Are there plans to include this carbon-free source? And also, will natural gas have a place in a clean energy standard?
I'm happy to start. So actually, there's a trend at the state level. The more that states pass standards, the more of them are technology inclusive. We have a tracker on the Third Way website where we're not just tracking state renewable and clean energy standards, but we're also tracking what technologies are included in those standards. And there's a definite trend where as these standards are trying to get actually all the way to 100%, they're mainly technology inclusive. And so I do think that, yes, in the past, we've seen state policies that exclude nuclear, but moving forward, we've seen technology inclusive state level policies. On the federal level, all of the policies being discussed would be inclusive of nuclear. I think there's a growing consensus of how important it is to preserve our existing nuclear fleet, which is responsible for half of our carbon-free power. Today, talk about the build out challenge that Devin was getting at. You lose that and it's a much more difficult challenge to build out clean electricity to replace it. You're just playing catch up. So a CES would help preserve our existing nuclear fleet. It would prevent existing nuclear from going offline early and has a lot of benefits. And it also creates demand for advanced nuclear technologies that we're rapidly seeing evolve and come down in cost. So it's being included in the federal discussion.
Well, I would add to that the existing hydro fleet in the nation is going to require a lot of investment and care and upkeep over time as well. So it's really important to include those resources in a federal CES to ensure that there's a source of revenue to help keep these facilities operational, particularly in light of the climatic changes that we're seeing, drought conditions, et cetera. With regard to the role of natural gas, I think it's going to be really important to recognize that we'll still be reliant on natural gas to provide reliable power when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing for quite some time. So we'll need to make the investments that are required in that fleet of resources and the fuel delivery infrastructure to make sure that those resources really are there when we need them to be. We will hopefully be able to transition to cleaner sources, whether it's cleaner fuels or other sources of clean firm over time. But that's going to be a slow transition. So first point is make sure that those resources are really there. Secondly, there is, I think, some benefit to providing an incentive for natural gas to dispatch instead of coal over the near term. So while we still have coal resources on the system, a bit of a danger of a federal CES that doesn't have this element is that you bring clean energy onto the system and you reduce the generation of natural gas and maybe even increase the generation from coal. So if there's a way to make the federal CES have that incentive to dispatch gas instead of coal, that's a big near-term source of carbon emission reductions that is very low cost. So there's some potential to incorporate a small incentive temporary for natural gas to generate over coal in the near term.
Yeah, in terms of the various roles of different technologies, I just can't emphasize the point of technology neutral and technology inclusive policy instruments, because right now none of us know. There is no single expert that knows the optimal role or the optimal fuel mix even next year. So we need to make sure we have this conversation about how technology should be able to compete on their merits in any type of policy reform context. So on the point of nuclear, I think mostly what we've seen in the States, right, is heavy RPS. And then we've seen nuclear support be this out-of-market one-off resource-specific subsidy, which has not only been very expensive, it's also tend to be rife with cronyism. And so one incremental improvement that states could pursue is to say, hey, maybe we take we convert an RPS to a CES, and we let all zero emissions resources, compete for that, rather than try to predetermine which resources stick around and under what terms. That would be an incremental improvement that could be politically feasible in some jurisdictions, and would expand the role of market forces in minimizing costs and driving that transition. And then to the role of natural gas, look, we always refer to natural gas as this bridge fuel, but really the length of that bridge, the width of that bridge, that should be determined by healthy markets, and healthy markets are inclusive of pollution externalities, which is why we're adamant proponents of competitive markets with pollution pricing built in. But we need to make sure if it's going to come up in a CES conversation, this is where we start getting to partial emitting or low emitting resources, and that's where a CES can get really clunky and challenging. But there are ways to do it, either based on a differentiated recognition of the different emission profiles of different natural gas technologies, but also the real-time emissions displacement of different types of low carbon resources on the system can have widely differing emissions profile consequences. So I think that's all right for a conversation on a CES if it gets traction.
Thank you very much. Next question here is from Jason Riot. Energy efficiency is if not the least cost energy resource. How will it be included in the standard or encouraged in conjunction with utility resource planning?
I hate to keep going first, but I have an answer. So the current federal proposals don't have like an additional crediting system for energy efficiency measures. However, since it's based on a percentage of clean energy that's naturally driving demand for energy efficiency to bring down the overall base. So a CES is a huge driver of energy efficiency, but the current proposals being discussed don't have like a separate crediting system for energy efficiency.
And it's challenging because then you get into baselining issues. But it does create the incentive for more efficiency, because if the less energy you're serving, the less of the clean energy that you have to buy. So that finds its way into the picture through cost effectiveness analysis at the state level. So I think it is an important driver, and there may be other things that we need to do to help that along.
Yeah, those are great points on energy efficiency. And the other thing I'll just throw in there is that it's not just about the baseline level of demand that energy efficiency can lower. It's ultimately going to be, we need to have much more flexible demand going forward. And so really kind of, if you will, defirming demand, the more we can do that, the less we need to excessively firm up supply with high renewables, where you're just going to have a ton of ebb and flow of resource availability at high renewables levels. So we need to make sure that a lot of our the consumption of electricity is really there to soak up a lot of renewables when they're available, and then to make sure we curtail low value uses of electricity on ideally a voluntary basis when that supply is momentarily not there.
Thank you very much. Next question here is for Devin from Jenna Lococo. Devin mentioned the need for permitting and regulatory reform. Do the panelists think a CES will be effective for meeting the timeline needed for net zero without permitting reform?
Well, I'll start, since I think it was a little bit more oriented to me, but I'll just say that right now, whatever incremental driver of demand there is, whether it's CES or I'm particularly very bullish on the corporate ESG movement, I think we're just getting started on that. Right now, we're not going to be able to meet the demand that's on the books right now. Just to give you a clear example right now, you know, the chairman of FERC made a recent observation, I think a month ago now, where he said 90% of the new projects that are trying to interconnect to the system are clean energy projects. And he said that as a precursor for talking about why there's a massive backlog in just one aspect of barrier to entry, and that's interconnection queue reform, or interconnection queue process, right? And so FERC is teeing that up for reform. There's so much more than this. We did an analysis recently on NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, where we found that, which is probably the most onerous like environmental permitting process right now. We found that right now, clean energy projects are outnumbering fossil projects in their NEPA review by almost a 3-to-1 margin. So right now, we're just seeing a lot of capital sitting on the sidelines. You talk to Wall Street and they say, hey, we want speed to market. Come on, we want to finance this stuff. We want speed to market. And then they sit there and you go back to them and they say, hey, well, it's a 5-year permitting process. Tack on a few more for siting. Oh, and by the way, there's going to be a few years for upfront planning, depending on the nature of the project. And it artificially raises costs, and it really delays any projects that do make it through the gauntlet. But I'll defer to my other panelists for particulars too.
I mean, I think those issues are very real. The queue is one that we've been grappling with for a long time. I think we really are just starting to grapple with the land use issues at the state and local level. And we're starting to see some pushback in places like Riverside County, and Central Washington State that I'm familiar with. I think we'll see a lot more of that. So I do worry about really aggressive timelines and whether, despite the capital that I think we can and will mobilize, just some of the practical barriers and very real challenges of trying to figure out where to site these industrial energy facilities. So the more that we can do to streamline the process, I think is really helpful. At the same time, those site impacts are very real, and I don't think we want to shortchange the ability of local communities to shape the environment in which they live and work.
I'll just add, we did a joint modeling project called the Decarb America Research Initiative, and we kind of explored that question around what if you're not able to site renewables at the rate that we would want to, and ran several different kind of constrained renewable scenarios as a result. And the takeaway is that you can't escape the large infrastructure challenge, right? You can change the type of resources that you build out. You can have more energy efficiency. You can have more distributed renewable resources with more firm dispatchable that are more energy dense, and you just don't escape this infrastructure challenge. So to me, that really reinforces how important it is to deal with some of these siting challenges. NEPA is foundational towards protecting our environment. I don't think dismantling NEPA is the answer here, but there's other ways that we can expedite the process for siting, and that's probably its whole other webinar. You still need the CES, and I think it will kind of drive these questions around the siting issue and make them more prominent. But I don't think it's a reason not to pass a CES because we're afraid we can't do the siting challenges. As we've discussed, there are safety valves in the CES that can account for issues like that, affordability questions, and be flexible to challenges like this.
Great, thank you. Looks like we do have time for one more question here from Eric Smith. How will the policy or proposed policies handle the different emissions profiles? For example, California has 2/3 of its emissions from transportation sources, while Louisiana has 2/3 of its emissions from industrial sources.
I think we have to recognize that a CES is a partial step. It addresses emissions on the power grid. It doesn't address emissions from the rest of the economy. We need to recognize that. We need to recognize its role. We still need policies to address the other sectors. And we need to recognize that some regions are cleaner than others. And so they'll have different supply curves and different compliance costs. So all those things need to be factored in. I think a national CES with a tradable certificate across 50 states is a good way, an efficient way to get to that scale.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, but ultimately one that's very difficult to address by any sector-specific emissions reduction tool. It's going to be really hard to do anything other than direct emissions cuts through a type of tool like this. But that makes a stronger point for more comprehensive emissions pricing. I think that's economy-wide.
Or other sector-specific policies targeted for the sectors that a CES does not address.
Maybe and or.
And or, we'll take it all.
Well, that's a good line to end on. In a way, I hate to jump in because I think we could continue this discussion for an hour, and it's obviously going to be debated in Washington for a significant period of time going forward. One thing we are going to do at OEP on our site, I encourage all of you in the audience, others in the community, to participate in an online discussion that will continue this conversation and weigh in with your thoughts and views. We got to as many questions as we could. We know there were more out there and a lot of perspectives on this. I really want to thank Todd and Lindsay, Arnie, Devin for a stimulating, insightful conversation, pointing out all the different perspectives on this. And of course, Senator Tina Smith for her introductory remarks and her involvement on this critical issue in Washington. To our audience out there, thank you for taking the time. We are going to take a break in August, so we'll be back in September with our next webinars. But in the interim, particularly on this issue, please weigh in online. Please use the Our Energy Library on the OEP website, which has the largest collection of reports, studies, papers, very well indexed on energy topics. So as you all out there are doing your work on these important issues, please take advantage of this resource that's available to you in the Our Energy Library on the OEP site. Finally, I really want to thank all of you for your support to date all year. We are really grateful to all of our partners, particularly today to our co-host, the Electric Power Supply Association, and to Todd, but to all of our partners. And we encourage everyone out there to get involved in what we're doing and be supportive. And thank you for what you've done so far. So to all of you, have a great August. Thank you for your support and your involvement. Stay healthy, stay well, and we'll see you very soon. Thanks again. Have a great weekend.